How's it going, everybody? It's Riley's Redzone here, back with another Redzone's roster previews episode, and in today's video, I'm going to be covering the Minnesota Vikings. And you can probably tell, given how much memorabilia I have of this team, they are my favorite team. And so if you're new to the channel and you didn't know that, here you go. And I think given this ranking, I think I'm pretty not biased in this situation, as considering ranking-wise, I don't even have them as a playoff team. So I have a feeling this episode may be a longer one, as I have more experience with these players, and I've watched the most preseason coverage of this team. So I think that this could potentially be a longer video. But if you are new to this series, this may be a different one, given this is my favorite team. But every single episode of this series, I take a look at an NFL team. I go from the worst to best, given my power rankings. And then I take a look at every single player. I predict whether they will make the team and be an impact and discuss how they can make an impact. And then I also project if there are players that will make the practice squad as a developmental guy, or maybe they'll be cut from the team. And then afterwards, I take a look at the schedule. I predict how many games each team can win. And then I also give out awards to top players that fit top categories. So with that being said, I'm going to jump right into talking about the Minnesota Vikings. As I mentioned, this could be a longer one, so get your popcorn ready, go get a snack, and just get ready for the show here. So, like in previous episodes, let's start by talking about the coaching staff, starting with Mike Zimmer, who has been around here for a long time. I actually have this signed picture of him from a long time ago. I mean, you can see this is like Brian Robinson. I mean, these are players that are nowhere near on the team anymore. And that was like his first or second year on the team that I wrote a letter to them and ended up getting a response back with that. So he has been around here for a long time on the Vikings. And he's been okay. I'd say solid overall. I mean, he's a defensive specialist for most of the seasons, except for maybe last year. He has been a defensive specialist that has had a good defense, a top 10 defense. At one point, one of the top in the league. There was a season that they made the NFC Championship with, Case Keenum on offense. So he can make it work with a poor offense. Now, this might be one of the best offenses he's ever had as a Vikings coach. I would say by far, potentially the best offense he's had to work with. So if this offense could take care of its job, I believe in Mike Zimmer to be confident in his defense. I think they're going to bounce back. They had a lot of young players last year, a lot of injuries. They bring in a lot of veteran players this year that I'll talk about that I think truly make a huge difference on this team. And is Zimmer on the hot seat? He's on the warm seat, basically, is what I would call it. He is not in a pressure to me where if he does not perform like unbelievable, like let's say they don't make the playoffs, I don't think he's out yet. But if they go below like 6 wins or something, I think he's gone. But I believe that won't happen. I think that Zimmer is good enough of a coach, now has an offense going, he has a defense that he likes. I think that he won't let that happen, and they will have a relatively decent year. I'll talk about the record later. They have kind of a tough schedule, give or take. So they may underperform their roster level. And as you may know from previous episodes, I rank these teams off of roster and coaching. So sometimes the records won't always correlate with where they are. So I like Mike Zimmer as a coach here still. One of the last defensive coaches. And so when you have a defensive coach, you need an elite defense. And I believe they bounce back this year. But if you're in a situation where you have a defensive head coach and the defense is your weakness, a.k.a. like Dan Quinn in Atlanta, for example, a great situation to compare it to. If you have a defensive coordinator leading your team whose defense is terrible, then it maybe doesn't work out. But I think they bounce back. And then they also still have, I'll talk about quick here, a changing of the guard with Clint Kubiak now being the coordinator, taking over kind of from his dad. I think they'll run a similar offense, and so we might see some similar players succeed. He is young, so I do think there could also be a bit of, question marks on the play calling and everything this year. That may not be good for them. But overall, it's going to be a similar system overall, and I think that players that have succeeded will succeed more, and some might be able to just ease into the system. So let's start talking about the players, starting with the quarterback position. They have, a player who is potentially one of the highest overpaid players in the league. He has brought in this team to the playoffs, I think once, thinking correctly here. It is disappointing kind of to see how much he's paid and has underperformed, but at the same time, I think that his value has almost been driven to the ground so far that he almost is not underrated. Like, he'll never be underrated again, but kind of underappreciated. Like, he's still a solid quarterback that can take a team to the playoffs. I don't know how confident I am in a Super Bowl, but with a good defense, I think that can happen, and this year is a great example of that could happen. So Kirk Cousins is a decent quarterback. Going back to it a few years ago, they had the option of keeping guys like Case Keenum, Teddy Bridgewater, or Sam Bradford. They chose not to keep any of those guys. They thought they were a quarterback away from the Super Bowl, and that clearly wasn't the case, I guess, at the time, or at least Kirk wasn't the right quarterback. They did take a step down, though, afterwards. They started losing some stars and everything after that on defense. So I think that looking back, I don't know if you always make this move, but you can't be upset that it happened, as he's still a solid potential game manager is what I would kind of explain it as. He has not done much to lose this team games over the past 3 years, but he has also not had any unbelievable performances that have been able to carry the team when the defense underperforms. So he's a middle-of-the-road quarterback at this point. I do think he's finally going to be surrounded with a better offensive line. He's got some top weapons. So basically what I'm saying is no excuses here. They also, kind of pulled what they did with Aaron Rodgers last year in Green Bay. They pick a quarterback maybe to, spark something out of Kirk Cousins here because the pressure is on. If he doesn't perform, they could move on from him here in Minnesota. So I do think that my potential plan for the Vikings is if they're going to go all out this year to try to make the playoffs, win a Super Bowl. If they don't within the next 2 years, what I basically am saying is I think they ride out Kirk's contract with Zimmer's contract, and then after that ship sails, you move on to the Kellen Mond era if it does not work out with Cousins. So speaking of Kellen Mond, let's talk about Kellen Mond, who I made a film breakdown video on this past season. So I feel pretty confident in Kellen Mond for who he is. And he had the situation already this offseason where he missed some time because testing positive. So that was a big hit for him, in my opinion, as Jake Browning was given the opportunity to be the only quarterback in the room and played well in some practices. He has not done great in the preseason game, but I'm more so focusing on Mond right now. Kellen Mond, and you can go back and watch my draft night reaction as well to when they took him, I thought was a solid choice because looking at the three quarterbacks that were in that range that were picked within 5 picks of each other, you had Kyle Trask, you had Kellen Mond, and Davis Mills. If you watch my rankings videos, well, I'm just saying videos I talked about, so then you can see my takes on it. I was very low on Davis Mills, so he was out of the question to me. But if you're looking between Trask and Mond, I did have Trask above Mond, but barely. But if for the Vikings' sake, I think Mond was a better pick, and they got him after Trask was taken anyways. And so, also in retrospect, to think that they turned that pick in the first round into Christian Darrisaw and Kellen Mond was very incredible, in my opinion. And it just made that pick better, given it was Kellen Mond. I like it because Kellen Mond is everything Kirk Cousins isn't. And so they're opposite of each other. And I've kind of always thought in my mind criticizing the Vikings for whenever they go out and get a backup, they get the most pocket passer, slow check down player of all time. I mean, Bradford had the highest completion percentage one season in history. He was throwing 3-yard checkdowns every play. they've had guys like Sean Mannion, and even when they brought in Keenum to be a backup, I mean, it was these guys are pocket passers. So I love them, even Jake Browning right now, Nate Stanley. So I love them going out and getting someone with the high upside. It's what this team has been lacking to me. I mean, you look at some of their best quarterbacks in history, Fran Tarkington could run around. Dante Culpepper could run around and had a strong arm. Those are, and even you keep going back, like Randall Cunningham, it's been a mobile quarterback that has been able to lead this team to success. And so I think Kellen Mond has the perfect opportunity for that. He's incredibly quick and can get first downs with his legs. He's not a go-to runner. He will run when the opportunity is there. And so you like that about him. His arm strength is very, very good. He can zip it into tight spaces and make some great plays down the field. His concern, though, was his accuracy, which might be Cousins' strength, is to know he's just consistent. So I like going, though, with the high upside here, is when you have top talent around him, they can go with Mond and see what happens, and given maybe even with the inaccuracy of Mond, you can still get some good plays down the field when you have top receivers with some speed. So I thought this was a perfect choice for the Minnesota Vikings, and Kellen Mond, I think, could potentially be the future. Now, it does not help that, he's listed behind Browning right now on the depth chart. But I think by the end of the season, they will turn to Kellen Mond as the backup. He just needs a little time in the system, and he did miss those days of training camp. So I do think that he will potentially be the future quarterback of the Minnesota Vikings. And let's talk about Jake Browning, who probably will be the backup this season. I think it was, in Zimmer's eyes, a positive when he did not miss any time in training camp, and so he got all those extra reps, and he has not performed well in the preseason. His number one concern has been he has not been getting rid of the ball very quickly, and so he is not finding open receivers quick enough without getting sacked, and that's been, a huge concern for Vikings quarterbacks for the past decade, basically. And so I personally don't love Jake Browning to be a future backup, but for one season while Mond develops, I think it's fine. As I mentioned, he's performed well in practice. We just haven't seen it in the games. So he has just not performed well in the games, but I feel like he can be a backup for 1 year. And I know Zimmer has not thrown out the possibility of bringing in a veteran quarterback as a backup. To me, you're fine. I'd even be fine just keeping Mond and Cousins, to be honest. I liked the Nate Stanley pick out of Iowa last year. That was one of my favorite late-round quarterback picks because I thought he was going to go middle of day 3. He ends up going in like the 7th round. But just seeing what's happening, I had him above Jake Browning at some point, and Jake Browning has clearly taken over this offseason above him. And honestly, it comes down to health. There's other players that have been able to get impact in the preseason games, get impact in the, joint practices that I was actually able to see one with against the Broncos and just against other competition in the preseason. Stanley has been injured for this entire time, and or at least not practicing very much, and so that's concerning to me. He's been, not even having pads on for a long time, and that's just hurt him. So I think that not being available is going to cost him, especially when you have other young quarterbacks in this room. So I think his time is up. So to review, the quarterback situation is fine. I think that Cousins is not particularly great at this point in his career. He's solid, I guess, just middle of the road, but I'm really excited to see what could potentially happen with Kellen Mond, given an opportunity to sit in the system. Maybe he can develop that accuracy, his football IQ with the playbook, because the intangibles are there, the skills are there, the physical traits are there. We just need to see it with the mental and the accuracy. So if he can improve that, you're looking for a future quarterback with Mond. The running back room is led by Dalvin Cook, one of the top running backs in the league, perhaps a favorite for Offensive Player of the Year this year. And, it's just been injuries his entire career. He's a solid pass catcher, solid runner of the football with open space. He has all the tools needed. He just has been hurt so often. Now, I think that last year he started given an opportunity. He did have some injuries as well, but I think we've been saying, he's going to step up and, be one of the best running backs in the league. And he finally, I think last year, was starting to prove that. And I think this year, if he can't stay healthy, I do think that he will prove to be one of it for sure. And so he offers everything for you. He needs to be your go-to back. But let's say you're in fantasy or something, you might as well pick up Alexander Mattison late, who is a solid backup running back. So Dalvin Cook is absolutely unbelievable. He has all the skills needed. He can catch, he can run, and I'd say he can pass block relatively well, I guess, even though that's not his strength. I think he's an absolute go-to back that can be the focal point of this offense. This team, I think, will go back to, and it kind of still has always been, but just a run-heavy offense. But now it's interesting that they have one of the best receivers in the league that we'll talk about in a bit. You have so many options on this offense that you can go with, but I do think the focal point and the centerpiece still needs to be Dalvin Cook. As I mentioned, they have Alexander Mattison behind him. I think that he has been a solid choice. I think there was a lot of criticism when they took him in like the third round to be a backup running back when they had Dalvin Cook. But as we've seen already, Cook can be injured. So Mattison is a solid backup option. Is not incredibly quick in my opinion, but definitely has a lot of power. And so it can be goal line, and otherwise just when Cook needs a rest, you can put Mattison in and still feel pretty good. So I like Alexander Mattison a lot as a player, and I think that he's proven himself to be a very good backup and kind of role player. And I think if he was on another team that didn't have Dalvin Cook, he'd be even more involved in other situations. So I kind of feel bad for him. They might never be a starter here in Minnesota full time. They also picked Kene Nwangwu, who has been dealing with an injury. We wanted to see what he had, but he wasn't able to show it. He might be a favorite, or at least a top candidate, a huge potential kick returner is really where I think he could see that impact. But, you know, we've got other options. They still have KJ Osborne, D.D. Westbrook they bring in, Amir Smith-Marset, Chad Beebe can still handle punts. And so they still have a lot of players that could compete for that. But I do think Nwangwu could potentially be a top option at that return spot. So he has the speed. We just haven't been able to see the opportunities here. I think it would be great for him if he was able to get some action this week in the third preseason game. I'm keeping Amir Abdullah, one of my last roster spots. Another player who's going to compete on special teams, not necessarily fully as a returner to me anymore. I think they have other options, but just as a running back special teamer. But otherwise, he can be a solid receiver coming out of the backfield. And honestly, picking him up since Detroit a few years ago, he's been okay as just a role player on this team, just never really been given full opportunities. And then CJ Ham, for what it's worth, is one of the best fullbacks in the league. He can block very, very well, and I actually am surprised how much they're able to get him in the receiving game and be not a weapon on offense, especially near the goal line. I think he can be a game changer, and that is what we see with guys like Kyle Juszczyk for the Niners. Is the fullback is slowly descending into an extinct state, but if you have a fullback, if you can use him well, that can be a true game changer. So that's who I have them keeping on the roster. A.J. Rose has been so solid in the preseason. He's probably been perhaps the best, if not one of the best performers this preseason. So I almost considered keeping him over Amir Abdullah. An undrafted rookie this year has absolutely shown out. His power has been phenomenal. He can bounce off of tacklers. He's made plays where I think it's going to be like a 3-yard gain and turned them into 7. So I think that this year has been a great opportunity for guys like A.J. Rose that wouldn't have had that opportunity last year with no preseason to really show out and show a reason why he should at least be on the practice squad, if not on the active roster. They also have Jake Bargas, who I've never been a huge fan of, but they've involved him this year as in a developmental and impact player in the receiving game as a backup fullback. So I'm choosing to keep him on the practice squad just because I think they are giving him a good amount of action in the games. But otherwise, you could go with other players. And they just recently brought in Ito Smith, and I like that as a potential just depth piece, but I just don't think there's enough time for him to really get used to the system. It sounds like they might be bringing him in potentially for pass blocking, which if so, maybe want to keep that instead of Amir Abdullah, but I just think Abdullah is more familiar with the system and he offers more on special teams. But this is a solid running back room, and obviously it all goes back to Dalvin Cook. But I think that potentially also you have great options behind him like Madison and Nwangwu. And so I think that this potentially is one of the best running back rooms in the league, and if you include the fullback, it's absolutely unbelievable. Let's move on to the receiver room, where the top two is absolutely clear. Justin Jefferson in my opinion, should have been the Rookie of the Year last year. I know Justin Herbert was phenomenal as well. You give it to either of them, it's fine. But I think that Justin Jefferson was unbelievable in that season. And he offers everything. He has speed. He is dealing with an injury right now, which is a bit concerning, but I think he's going to be back for week 1. Scary play at practice a few weeks ago, but he's back out there on the practice field in some capacity. So I'm feeling good about his health going into the season. And so as long as he's good there, I think it's great for him. Last year he wasn't even involved in the offense until like week 3, and he still broke the rookie receiving records. And so he is now, to me, taking over that number 1 role in this offense and offers tons of skills all over the field when it comes to route running. You still have Adam Thielen, who is a touchdown machine at this point in his career. Not maybe one of the quickest guys, but a great route runner. Specifically as well, great on the sidelines, in the end zone, in the boundaries. Another top player, but I do think Jefferson has taken over this wide receiver one role for this team. And so for fantasy purposes, it's like, who's going to be that 3? Is anybody worth drafting? I personally don't think anybody's worth drafting in fantasy football as that 3, but KJ Osborne has been the guy that has performed the best out of this group. So you feel solid in your top 2. You know those are your top 2 guys. It's what do you have here behind that? And to me, it comes down to 3 guys that are really competing for this job. KJ Osborne has been, with maybe Oli Udoh, the off-season story for the Vikings in camp. He has started to perform very well. He's getting out there with the ones as a third receiver. I think he's not necessarily done anything crazy in the preseason, but has been okay, I guess. But more so in camp, he's just performed well. He was a disappointment last year. I actually didn't love the pick. They tried him out at returner, wasn't particularly great, but this year it seems as though he's improving, potentially could be an impact in the receiving game. So he has really shown up this offseason. You also have D.D. Westbrook, who I thought was a great signing as somebody who they picked up late in this offseason, but he has not played a single down for this team yet and barely had any reps at practice, if at all. So he's still coming back from that injury from last year, but I do think it is unfortunate for him that some other players have started to potentially make an impact. But I think Westbrook could potentially fight his way to a return spot. As I mentioned, they have so many guys on this team that are competing for it, but I think it ends up coming down to Nwangu, who I think will be more kick returner. Osborne could be a kick returner as well, and I think the punt return job is going to come down to the 3 receivers listed before Osborne there on the roster. I think it's going to come down to Westbrook, Smith-Marset, and Beebe. And Westbrook, I think, potentially could be the punt returner, but more so, I think, if he can be an impact in the receiving game, if he was healthy, I think that he would have already beaten Osborne out for that third receiver role. But I thought it was a great signing, and I'm honestly hoping they don't cut him. Because although he hasn't been able to show his skills, I think he's worth keeping over some other players. Amir Smith-Marset has also been a baller this offseason. Has looked great in camp and then in the preseason as well. He's made some unbelievable plays, and just specifically over the middle and on short routes. And there's even been some plays where the quarterbacks collectively have missed him, and he's still making plays, afterwards, even though he's getting open. Just the quarterbacks aren't seeing him. So I think that overall, he has been a huge, nice pickup for them so far this year, and I think that he will compete for the punt return job. And honestly, in my opinion, I think that he should be the favorite. I think that he offers a lot of skills there, has a lot of speed, and then could potentially be the slot receiver in this offense as well. So although Osborne has been performing well this year, in the long term, I'm giving it to Smith-Marset. And Chad Beebe, for as legendary he is around the Vikings, is kind of a meme. He's like my last roster spot. I like to keep your 6 receivers, but the day I went to joint practice watching him against the Broncos there, he dropped like 2 to 3 punts, and if he can't be a returner, he's had some drop balls still. I think he still needs to work on his hands. His time might be running out. Although I love Chad Beebe as much as the next guy as a player. I think he can be at times an underrated receiver, and when you're in a pinch and need something to happen, Beebe is a good go-to guy. But I think if he loses that punt return job, and I'm thinking he is, it's not looking good for him. Practice squad, I'm keeping Dan Chisna because of his speed. that's a special team, might need to be a special teams player. And then it hurt not putting Walt Phillier on the practice squad. He's been a great performer at camp. Honestly, look great. I just ended up, do I keep him or Jake Vargas is basically what it came down to me. And maybe Shane Zylstra is another guy that I'll talk about in a bit, that maybe those are guys that are on the bubble, potentially. Shane Zylstra I don't have making either, but those are guys that are kind of on that bubble that I don't have making the practice squad that maybe you could. And Wap, to me, has performed great, both in camp and in the preseason. They also have Myron Mitchell, who is, to me, is hanging on. He's performed relatively okay, but he was out of practice for a bit. Same reason as Kellen Mond. But I don't know how to feel. Like, I love Jefferson and Thielen as this duo, one of the best in the league. But then it's who can get that number 3 spot. And to me, in my opinion, I'm going with Amir Smith-Marset. But otherwise, D.D. Westbrook is a good way to start. And KJ Osborne has performed well this offseason, so I'm going to give him credit there. Let's go to the tight ends, where we're waiting for the Irv Smith Jr. breakout season. I think this is the year it finally happens. I love that pick when they made it. They had slower tight end like Kyle Rudolph and David Morgan at the time, and Tyler Conklin. They were all slower guys. They finally pick up a quicker guy who can catch, Irv Smith Jr. And so I think this is the year it finally breaks out for him. He's going to be given the opportunity in this tight end room. I think that it's clearly his room, and I think Kirk likes his tight ends too. So I think that overall Irv Smith will break out this year, given an opportunity, and will make the most of it. I think that Tyler Conklin behind him is not exactly my favorite backup. He's been okay. I think he's fought his way up the depth chart, past a few other players. But, over the last few years. But I think at this point they might just need him to be a run blocker. And maybe if he can do that, that can be good for them. Just to have somebody there. Because then Zach Davidson is a receiving threat. He's a huge player. A former punter from where he came from, but I thought it was a solid choice. Just why not take a small school guy, see what you got there? And so I'm going with him. Brandon Dillon is kind of the same thing, just been in the league longer, but a little slower. And I like Davidson more. So I'm keeping Dillon on the practice squad. Thinking about Shane Zylstra, though, too. Those are both young players that potentially can make the practice squad. But you're pretty much just hoping for the Irv Smith breakout this year, and I think it finally does happen. That's really what you have in this tight end room. Otherwise, Conklin's okay for blocking, and Davidson can be that jump ball receiver. Now, the offensive line. This is the big one, right? This has been the weakness for this team for the last half a decade, maybe even a full decade. And this is where it all comes down to, I was shocked kind of where I have this team, because this team has improved in almost every aspect this offseason. I don't think they regressed at all. In my opinion, they only got better. But this offensive line, for everything they've done, I think they've hit some bad injury luck, and they're not using guys in the right spot, basically. Christian Darrisaw, who they took in the first round this year. I was not a Christian Darrisaw guy this year in the draft. I had other players, including Tevin Jenkins, who a lot of people maybe had below him. I had him above him. I definitely had, Penei Sewell and Rashawn Slater above him. So I think Darrisaw ended up being my tackle 4, unless I'm forgetting somebody. And so I just didn't see the top 10 pick or top 15 pick talent there. But at 20-something, whatever, I think it was 22 or 23 that they got him at. Whatever it was, at that point was a steal. Because the Jets ended up taking Vera Tucker with that pick. And I liked Vera Tucker. I think I had him above Darrisaw as well. But that was also a huge reach, in my opinion. If you were going to reach for one of the guys, it would have made more sense to reach for Darrisaw because he has a higher upside and has more raw strength. But they ended up turning, if you turn that into Vera Tucker, they basically turned Elijah Vera Tucker into Christian Darrisaw and Kellen Mond. And to me, I'm taking that side of the deal 10 out of 10 times. And so even though I was not a huge Christian Darrisaw guy, the value is unmistakable. Now, what does Christian Darrisaw offer? Well, first, right now, he's offering an injury because he's not really getting much playing time. And that is such a terrible break because I don't want the Vikings starting Rashad Hill right away. I know he stepped in and he's a fine player for a few games, but we've seen this route too many times. We need Darrisaw out there as soon as possible for the Vikings. He is a power player. I thought he was a much better run blocker than a pass blocker. Now, I know the big stat for him was like he didn't allow a sack, I think, all year, or maybe it was one. A very low amount in his college career, but I saw him more as a run blocker, in my opinion. Just because of his power, and that makes sense. You know, when you have Dalvin Cook and that's going to be the center of your offense, it makes sense to go with a run blocker. So I think he's solid left tackle. I'm just concerned about this injury. I'm hoping he's going to be ready on time, because if you start him versus Rashad Hill, and it just hurts, even if he's ready to go, he hasn't got much time with the playbook, and that's unfortunate, because if you have Christian Darrisaw, that is miles ahead of starting Rashad Hill. They also have Ezra Cleveland, a converted tackle to guard, who I liked them doing that last year. Let's just start the best players at where they can. Took him out of Boise State last year. I thought it was a great value. And I think that he takes a step up this year at that guard spot, and I think it makes sense to start him at left guard. They also still have Garrett Bradbury, who as a first-round pick has honestly not performed up to that level to me at that spot, but he's been fine as a center. Still has some power, but can also just get manhandled at certain times. I think that is kind of unfortunate there if he is kind of underperforming, but I do think he's been okay. Like, he's not been something where I feel solid. Like, I feel better with Brian O'Neill at right tackle than I do with Garrett Bradbury at center, but right guard is the open competition spot, and unfortunately, they've been giving Dakota Dozier a bunch of reps, and I don't understand that. Oli Udoh, who's been on this team for a few years as a developmental tackle, kick him into guard this year. He's been another, him and KJ Osborne have been the two guys who have really shown up this offseason. And Oli Udoh, who has a lot of power and strength, might have fought his way onto a starting spot at the right guard. And so that is great for him potentially. I do think he offers more upside than Dakota Dozier. Just Dozier needs to get off the team, in my opinion. But honestly, I'd be starting Wyatt Davis right away. And I know that sounds crazy because he's a rookie, but in my opinion, I like Oli Udoh, but I'd rather just put Wyatt Davis out there and let's just have the young offensive line where Brian O'Neill would be the most experienced. I would honestly rather go with the upside there. So Brian O'Neill is a solid player. He's performed into such a great player at right tackle, developmental guy who is, he was more of a guy who needed some fundamental technique and had that a little bit, but just needed some development time. And he has really performed up to it now that he's been given time. Great pass blocker overall and pretty good at run blocking as well. Just pretty quick for a tackle as well. Just absolutely solid. Has turned out to be a steal. I kind of talked about Rashad Hill. I don't feel great about him being a season-long starter. So I'm hoping that Christian Darrisaw can get back at any moment possible, because I don't feel great with Rashad Hill at tackle. Wyatt Davis, as I mentioned, I would be starting him at right guard. He's been getting like 13 reps. But they've also tried him out at center, and so they like versatility on their line, and so that's fine. But in my opinion, I'm putting Wyatt Davis out there as soon as possible. Drew Samia was, a disappointment as a starter last year, but I still believe in the upside there as a depth piece at guard, so I'm sticking with him, and that's fine to me. As a depth piece, I'd rather have him over Dakota Dozier. And then Mason Cole, I thought was a solid trade this offseason just to get a backup lineman. It's an upgrade over like Brett Jones, who they've had for a few years now as a backup lineman. So I like that a lot. Practice squad, I'm keeping two young players in Blake Brando and Kyle Hinton. Makes two up there. But Kyle Hinton is the higher upside guy to me. He could potentially make the roster, but he still offers some power. But I don't know how the Vikings are playing Dakota Dozier moving on to the cuts still on this team. I just don't understand. I don't know how he's still getting first team reps. I know he has a lot of experience, but he has, he cost the team 2 points in the first game. Then he had multiple penalties afterwards still. Just terrible performance in the preseason games. He needs to be gone as soon as possible in my book. They still have some other players behind that, I like them bringing back Evan Skierziak. Zarzik. That's a tough name to pronounce. Sorry if I said that incorrectly. But I liked him coming out of Buffalo a few years ago. They had him for a bit, and then he wasn't on the team last year. They bring him back. I like that just as a depth piece, but I just don't think he makes a team. Zach Bailey, I thought was a solid pickup as a depth piece, but they have him listed at right tackle. I think he's played guard most of his career, and I like him better at guard. But he can play tackle or guard. I guess they like the versatility. And then Cole Cabral was a solid as well, just depth piece pickup to be, in training camp and everything. But I don't think any of those guys make the team. So this is a solid offensive line. There's a number of combos that could happen based on the injuries, but in my opinion, their best lineup out there would be Darisaw, Cleveland, Bradbury, Davis, and O'Neal. And if so, I'm feeling pretty good about the offensive line. So let's move on to the defense, which of course is Zimmer's specialty. So starting with the defensive line, they get Danielle Hunter back, one of the best edge rushers in the entire league, great at the pass rush. Good amount of speed. They get him back from injury. He missed all of last year, and that is huge to get one of the top pass rushers in football back on their team. So that is absolutely great news for Vikings fans, as he will potentially, bounce back to his top tier form. Now, my underrated player on this team that I'll talk about again later, that may be a hint, DJ Wanham. I didn't understand the pick too much at the time last year, but boy, did he perform, in my opinion, very, very well last year when given opportunities. And so I think that he has the highest upside potentially, at least more than Stephen Weatherly and probably close to Patrick Jones. And I also think that it's interesting. I think they like him a lot because they're also trying him out at third linebacker. I'll talk about it in a bit. But that third linebacker spot is also up for grabs. But I think that DJ Wanham now has the ability to line up on the edge and also line up standing up. It's just a cut in coverage. I think that potentially he can be a Swiss Army knife of this defense, and he could be used in a way that a Zimmer defensive player has not been used very much before. So I think he is an underrated player, and I think watch out for him this year. As I mentioned, Patrick Jones, they took him relatively early in the draft this year in the 3rd round. I think he does have some upside, some explosiveness. It's just, can he make his way up the depth chart? Because they bring back Everson Griffin, who spent some time last year in Dallas and Detroit, and it didn't really work out in either. I do think he still potentially could perform well now, given back in his, comfort home here in Minnesota. But I think that he is not what he used to be, but still could be a nice veteran at minimum and at least be in the rotation potentially. Otherwise, Stephen Weatherly, they also bring back. It's crazy how many players they just brought back. It says something about Zimmer's culture and identity on defense. But Stephen Weatherly was a solid pickup, but I do think his time is starting to potentially, the clock's ticking. Stephen Weatherly, now with Griffin back, I think Everson Griffin could potentially start, but basically the time for me before was Weatherly was either going to start or he was going to be cut. It does help him. Janarius Robinson was put on IR this week, and if you're put on IR this early, you have to miss the entire season. So for him, that was good news because I think that Janarius Robinson had the opportunity here to potentially take that spot from him. I mean, he had higher upside. They took him in like the 5th round, so I think they would have ended up keeping Robinson over Weatherly if it came down to it. So it's good news for Weatherly. And then Jalen Holmes has been a huge performer this offseason and training camp and the preseason. He has kind of been all over. He started, I'd say, as a DN, then he converted to D tackle. Now he's kind of back to DN as a pass rusher, and I think he's performed well enough to keep a spot on this team. And so that he's really just played good enough for me to keep him. Hercules Mataafa has been a preseason warrior over the past few years. He could potentially be on the cut list now as well, I would say, but I'm keeping him around. And then Kenny Willekes, who I liked coming out of Michigan State last year. They took him late in the draft. That was a great value, and I think it has shown to be he's performed relatively well in the preseason. So he can be on the practice squad at minimum here. Probably that's where he ends up. So I love this edge room because even though Hunter is your only sure thing as a starter, you have an open competition. I love any of those 4 guys between Wanham, Jones, Griffin, or Weatherly. I'm comfortable starting any of them. So I absolutely love this edge room. And it only gets better with the depth on this defensive line where they get new faces And this is a huge upgrade. It's what they needed. They bring in Michael Pierce last year. Does not play it down for them since he opted out. They get him back. It's basically an addition for them. And so he can be a huge run stopper and can clog up the middle, almost replacing like that Linval Joseph role that was here for a few years. And I think Michael Pierce is honestly better than Linval Joseph. So I think that he overall is a great player to have back. And it's good to also pair him up with Dalvin Tomlinson, who I also thought was a solid signing from New York this year. Definitely, I think could be more of an impact in the pass rushing game than Michael Pierce. But so you put those two together, and man, this defensive line is dominant. You still have Sheldon Richardson, who they brought back as well, some familiarity in this scheme. To think he's a third D tackle on this team is incredible. I think he would be starting on a lot of teams. So he is absolutely a great depth piece. I think Tomlinson and Richardson both offer more pass rushing ability than Pierce does. So you combine that. And then Armon Watts as well has performed very, very well when given opportunities over the past few years. A solid pass rusher. So I think that this defensive line is absolutely loaded. Like, there's not a single player. I mean, maybe Jalen Holmes would be the guy I was let go of. But besides that, there's not a guy where I'm saying, maybe I'd replace him with somebody else. I feel great with everybody there. And like a guy like James Lynch, who I loved them picking last year out of Baylor in the 4th round. I have him on the practice squad now just because of how much depth they have. But, you know, he could potentially make it. I've been cutting Ziande Johnson. But, man, this edge room and the D-line paired together is just unbelievable. So let's move to the linebackers, where you have Eric Kendricks, one of the most unappreciated, in my opinion, linebackers in the game. He's a top 5 backer, in my opinion. I think that he is elite in coverage and has stepped up to really be a field general at this point, where he can call the defense, he can call out bluffs and motions and everything just that needs to switch. I think that he is an elite linebacker that's one of the best in the game, and I think that him now, with how many experience years he has on him, has become one of the best in the league. And then you get Anthony Barr back, another player to get back from injury, barely got to play last year, has a lot of speed, and still with Eric Kendricks. I think that those two together are the sure things at linebacker. But then that third linebacker spot is up for grabs. Nick Vigil, who has, spent some time in Cincinnati, and then I think he spent time in Los Angeles last year. He's a sure thing tackler, and so his upside is not incredibly high, but I do like him as the favorite right now to be that third linebacker. But Troy Dye, who I love them picking last year in the draft as well, has also proven to be a solid player. He had a pick 6 last week in the preseason game. He has proven to be, I think, a young developmental player who could potentially start as well. And so, to me, the starting spot goes to one of those two. But then you also have Chaz Surratt, who they took this year out of North Carolina, solid tackler as well, to be that backup middle linebacker. But that third linebacker spot really is up for grabs, and I'm interested to see who gets it. Blake Lynch I like a lot as well. Just couldn't really find space for him on this team, but he could at least be on the practice squad. Then Ryan Connolly, I liked it as a depth piece, but I didn't necessarily love the pickup last year from the Giants. And Tuff Borland I thought was a solid undrafted rookie choice. Just not enough space on this team. So the linebackers are pretty solid as well. Kendricks and Barr are a great duo at that third spot, though, up for grabs. And I've been keeping 6 corners because I think they need every one of them. It's been their weakness, I'd say, for a bit now. But Patrick Peterson was a great pickup. I was so shocked they were able to actually get him in here. And I think it's a great choice. He can be a number 1 corner. I mean, Xavier Rhodes was a number 1 corner for this team for a number of years, and, they made it to the NFC Championship with that. I think Patrick Peterson is even better than that. So I think that's an absolutely solid pickup from this offseason. He's a veteran. He's already teaching young guys like Chris Boyd different skill sets. So I absolutely love that pickup. And then they also bring in Bashaud Breeland, who Cameron Dantzler, kind of jumping around here, has underperformed this offseason. So I think that was a solid choice to bring in Bashaud Breeland, some starting experience for a number of teams. So I think that he, at this point, is a solid depth piece that will probably end up starting for this team on the outside, as Mackenzie Alexander they bring back. He spent time in Cincinnati last year. one of the best slot and nickel corners in the league for sure. So I think that was a solid bring back as well. So potentially 3 new corners, at least compared to last year, which is great because they had to start rookies and stuff last year. So that is interesting to note. As I mentioned, Cameron Dantzler, he just looks slower this offseason. I mean, he got burnt by KJ Hamler that first preseason game. Didn't look good in the last one either. He's just kind of looking slower right now, and that's not what you need. He had a good season last year, but he is starting to potentially fall down the depth chart. I thought he was going to take a huge step up this year. Harrison Hand, they also took last year. Potentially could be a developmental depth piece on this team still. But I like the way Chris Boyd has performed this preseason. I couldn't let him go. I mean, he's a special teams player, but more so I think he's locked up on defense, whether it's near the goal line or just on the sidelines. I think he's been absolutely dominant this preseason. And then Ty Smith and Perry Nickerson are 2 players I have been cutting. They're veterans. But this corner room to me has taken a huge step up, and it's went from young players that maybe just needed some time to we're ready to go win a Super Bowl with this corner room now. The safeties, on the other hand, I love their starters, but the depth is not there, so I'm only keeping 3, and I don't love that. I like to keep at least 4, but starting with Harrison Smith, Harry the Hitman, who is also, Harry the Int Man last year with some interceptions. He does everything for you. He's a veteran on his team, and he just is so dominant still, even at his age. And so I absolutely love them having a presence like that on the defense. He does everything for you, whether it's pass coverage, stopping the run, and just absolutely can rush the passer still a bit too. I mean, just absolutely dominant. Then Xavier Woods I thought was a solid pickup, just kind of been a starter for Dallas the past few years, and I like them bringing, they potentially, with the loss of Anthony Harris, really needed that replacement, and I think Xavier Woods was a good option for that. Cameron Bynum, on the other hand, has really underperformed this preseason. They took him kind of as a corner out of Cal, but they sent him in as a safety, and I think that's what he plays to start right now. They want to convert him, but he's honestly underperformed. In coverage, he just has not really, it's not even been a speed or anything, it's just him not knowing like when he needs to double and when he needs to go deep, and that's kind of hurt his corners a bit. And so Miles Dorn is a guy who has performed well this year in the preseason, so I thought about keeping him. Josh Metellus, a hard hitter ever since Michigan, took him in the draft last year. I think he's a practice squad player at this point. And then I have them cutting Luther Kirk just as a player that I think is not quite ready to make a roster. But I love Harrison Smith, and I love the Xavier Woods pickup. But Cameron Bynum has been kind of disappointing, but you need to keep at least 3 safeties. Their special teams, I remember, just bouncing around from Daniel Carlson to then Dan Bailey, who we all thought was a solid pickup at the time. He had like one of the highest field goal percentages in NFL history at the time. Didn't really work out in Minnesota. It's where kickers go to die, basically. So hopefully Greg Joseph already got a Super Bowl ring last year with the Bucs, so he's kind of already hit a peak with that. But I think he's a solid kicker. He's actually performed well. At one point, they had Riley Patterson for depth here to compete, but he's not there anymore. And so Greg Joseph, to me, I was there at a joint practice where he hit every ball I saw, missed a kick last preseason game, but otherwise I think he's looked solid, and to me it's his kicking job. I don't think they're going to bring anybody else in, and I feel confident with Greg Joseph right now as my kicker. Britton Colquitt didn't perform well the first preseason game, performed well the second one, and has really turned it around, and Andrew DiPaola is just who they're trying out, long snapper. So this roster is solid. They've improved. Still some similar weaknesses, but I think they've improved a lot, and it's shocking to me, honestly, that I ended up not having them higher up in the rankings. So now let's take a look at the schedule for this team and predict how many wins they could potentially get. So let's take a look at the schedule, where if you're new to this series, I give out 50-50 games, where I'm basically saying this team will win one of those 2 games that are the same color. So, for example, in this case, the Cardinals and the Ravens are the same color. So, I also give automatic L's and then automatic W's. Now, I will also say, it feels weird. I may have already, messed up the system kind of, but this is my first year doing this. So, I thought this was good logic. It feels weird to me that a 7-10 team, who I have them going, has so many 50-50 games. Like, this team is ranked 16, and if there's 14 playoff teams, I would have thought that the guys and the teams on the kind of the brink and the edge of the playoffs would have, been closer to 500, but maybe it's more so the schedule. At least in this case, as I have no automatic W's for this team, which is rare. Honestly, a pretty tough schedule overall here. So, no automatic W's. We've had them in a few episodes now, but not this one. But they start, it's kind of hard to say. Like, I guess it makes sense if you look at it. I mean, this team is literally my definition of the middle. So it makes sense they'd have the most 50-50 games of any team yet. So I guess that, this kind of makes sense. They're just in the middle. So, they just have a lot of not many easy games to win. So I'm just going to be saying a lot of winnable games. So the Bengals, I've already revealed. I think that's very winnable. For sure. The Cardinals, Seahawks, both tough. Browns, tough. I have them splitting the Lions, but also both maybe a sweet potential. Panthers, I think as well, are winnable. I've revealed them. The bye week is not in a great spot. I like middle or late buys. And for a team like this, I'm thinking middle would have been more ideal, but they're pretty early. So I don't love that. But then they have the Cowboys, who I revealed. The Ravens are tough. Chargers are tough. Packers are really tough with Aaron Rodgers back. I have them getting swept there, but you could go 50-50 there too. And then Niners are tough. Lions, I have revealed, as I mentioned, could potentially sweep them. Steelers are, I think, one of the best defenses in the league. Bears, I've revealed. That's potential, for some wins there. Rams and Packers, I think, are both top teams this year. And then they close it out with the Bears. So this is overall just kind of a tougher schedule with how many 50-50 games I end up having them for. Just no automatic W. So they end up going 7-10. And I don't know if that feels right, to be honest. I think they are a better roster than 7-10. I think they're a 9 or 10 win roster, but that's what I got in the schedule. And like I said, we'll see as I get farther and farther with the teams. I'll see if the schedule ends up changing it all, basically. But my offensive player of the year is actually going to go to Dalvin Cook. It could be Justin Jefferson here, but I'm going to go to Dalvin Cook just because I feel like more of the offense is going to pivot to Dalvin Cook, basically, even though Justin Jefferson might be a better, like, for when he's given opportunities and maybe more of an X factor because of, his ability to be deep and maybe make a difference maker for Kirk. But I do think that Dalvin will be given more opportunities on offense, and that's what it really comes down to. I think the offense will revolve around Dalvin Cook versus Jefferson's going to be that go-to piece. My defensive player of the year also comes down to 2 players or 3. I'm going to give it to Eric Kendricks, and it comes down between him, Danielle Hunter, and Harrison Smith, and it's very close for me between him and Danielle Hunter. I'm just going to give it to Kendricks because he's been healthy the past 2 seasons, and he has experience and is kind of the leader now, I feel like, at this point on defense. Now, my breakout player of the year, I know I said Irv Smith's going to break out. I could have went really deep and said like KJ Osborne or something, but my breakout player of the year, kind of a shocker, and this may not end up working out at all, but I'm going to go DJ Wanham. I think the ability that they can line him up on the edge, the D-line, and the linebacker position shows great flexibility. I do think the signing of Everson Griffin hurt his cause a bit, but I feel like Wanham can still be a starter, or at least be in the rotation. So I feel actually pretty good about that. Then I'm giving it to Darisaw for Rookie of the Year. I think he might be the only rookie that really, really starts. But my dark horse, watch out for Amir Smith-Marset this season. I truly think he can be a difference maker. It's just whether the coaches will give him the opportunity. I think if they give him the opportunity to be the number 3 receiver, he's going to take it and run with it. But if not, that may be the case where Darisaw might be the only starter. So, thank you so much for sticking around this late in the video. If you are still watching, this was, looking at the time, my longest go-to recording, at least just giving off the first take times. So, thank you so much for sticking with the series and everything, and I'm going to hopefully, as I mentioned, it's getting close to kind of the end of the season. well, to the beginning of the season, so I don't know if I'm actually fully going to be able to make it, but we're making a lot of ground here, and we're going to get close. So, with that being said, thank you so much for watching this video, and I will see you in the next one.